Hello, and thank you for coming to this talk on a December afternoon, especially at the end of a long semester. In thinking institutionally about technology design for social inclusion, I'd like to draw your attention to three people who were given the highest professional recognition in their respective fields last year and whose work I deeply admire. To the right is Mr. Balakrishna Vithaldas Doshi, the Ahmedabad-based architect who was awarded the Pritzker Prize for Architecture last year. Mr. Doshi also happens to be the first Indian to be awarded the Pritzker Prize, since it was first established in 1979 by the family behind the Hyatt group of hotels. The person in the middle, the lady, is Aruna Sairam, who was named the Sangeeta Kalanidhi by that bastion of music tradition, the Madras Music Academy. And of course, the Sangeeta Kalanidhi is arguably the highest professional recognition that one can get in the field of classical music. To the left is Paul Romer, who was jointly awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics last year for his work that showed how technological innovation, technological change and innovation are critical to long-term economic growth. We'd always suspected that, but Romer was among the earliest to model that, to show that in very rigorous terms. In a sense, all three of them are what you might call designers. And why is it? Because if you look at the term design, and here I'm referring to the Cambridge Dictionary, design as a verb means to make or draw plans for something. It means to intend. As a noun, it means the way in which something is planned and made, like a pattern. So you can think of the buildings of Mr. Doshi as design, as certain kinds of patterns, certain plans. The ragas that are elaborated by an Aruna Sairam as another kind of patterns. And the way, Romer has drawn upon history of our thinking about innovation with contemporary techniques and modeling as another kind of weave of ideas and another set of patterns. Now, the question though is that how do the individuals whom we admire and decorate achieve what they do in their respective fields? Now, are there ways and means of encouraging the emergence of such individuals, instead of merely relying on innate notions of creativity, genius, or talent? Now, the argument in this presentation is that solving increasingly complex challenges to ensure that social groups are not excluded from the benefits others enjoy cannot be left to individuals. Rather, there's a need for alternate social arrangements, which I'll refer to as the hybrid domain later on in the presentation, to generate at least satisficing designs, even if those designs are not altogether satisfactory or acceptable. Now, these social arrangements are what Douglas North, another Nobel laureate, referred to as institutions. In other words, these might be thought of as rules which are humanly devised constraints that structure political, economic, and social interactions. And institutions can either be formal, that is, constitutions, they can take the form of laws and property rights, etc., or they can be informal. They take the form of sanctions, taboos, customs, traditions, or codes of conduct. Right? Now, just to give you an example of what I'm saying by taking the case of Mr. Doshi. Now, the award of the Pritzker Prize to Mr. Doshi recognized his work, to be sure. However, it's worth recalling that Mr. Doshi runs a large office in Ahmedabad, and over a period of time, he has had any number of people work alongside him, right, who have helped in creating or co-creating what he has been recognized for. And furthermore, Mr. Doshi also, although he did not complete his architectural training at Sir J.J. School of Architecture, also had the privilege of working with two of the most distinguished names in 20th century architecture. When working, he actually worked alongside the famous Swiss architect Le Corbusier when he was planning and designing Chandigarh. Later on, he also had the privilege of working with the great American architect Louis Kahn when Kahn was designing the IIM Ahmedabad campus. So in a sense, this was not something that was exclusive to Mr. Doshi alone. His work over a period of time reflects a variety of influences. Another reason why the Pritzker Prize went to Mr. Doshi was because he founded and established the Center for Environmental Planning and Technology in Ahmedabad, which is arguably the finest architecture school in the country. And that reputation too came, of course, in part from Mr. Doshi's own stature in the profession, but also from his ability to attract a superb range of faculty who in turn drew to the school over a period of time some excellent students. So Mr. Doshi's work, in a sense, recognizes his ability to create certain institutions jointly with others, whether it is his own office, Sangat, or CEPT, which provided the means through which much of his work was achieved. So this is what I'm trying to say, which is that it's not just a question of saying this individual or that, even though we tend to by and large recognize individuals. So what is the larger question is, what are these sort of institutional means that we can that will ensure that we get more of Mr. Doshi's, whether it's an Aruna Sairam or a Paul Romer. Now, of course, the need for teamwork is not a new idea, and it has been pointed out by people like Adam Smith and Emily Durkheim. And they recognize that an increasingly fine-grained division of labor increases economic efficiency and social solidarity as societies industrialize. Now, to enable solidarity and minimize uncertainty in social interactions, there have evolved institutions. And since the mid or late 19th century, the dominant institutions that have structured economic, political, and social life have been the state and the market in the public and the private domains, respectively. And the dichotomous state market-led development models have delivered over this last 150 years or so historically unprecedented prosperity, and the standards of living have gone way beyond what our, say, forefathers in the 17th or the 18th centuries could have imagined. Yet, the limitations of the 20th century's institutional model is evident in the inability to ensure that the prosperity is shared. A vast majority of the population is still excluded from many of the benefits that people like us in this room take for granted, whether it's access to clean water, a good healthcare system, education, or whatever else. Now, why is that? That is because of state failure in many poor countries and its increasing retreat in advanced industrial countries. And these in turn have contributed to and sort of reinforced inequality. Similarly, while markets are good at allocative efficiency, corporate scandals, especially in recent times, bribery, outrageous salaries, etc., have rendered the private sector increasingly suspect. Now, these growing inequities are evident in challenges of access to physical and social infrastructure and in acute crises of various forms. There's financial crises, environmental crises, and there's now even the talk, as the sociologist Manuel Castells has put it, the rise of a fourth world. Now, to dig a little deeper into understanding why these sort of, or to explaining these sort of empirical phenomenon, okay, it's useful to understand this distinction between the state and the market in more analytical terms. And for that, I'll point to this diagram on this slide. Now, traditionally, right, we've had the state providing public goods and the market providing private goods. And this distinction is based on certain properties of goods that economists have traditionally used. Private goods are defined as those that are excludable and rival. What does excludability mean? It's the ability to keep out other individuals or other sections of society from accessing certain goods and services. And the best way of doing that is pricing. So if you're able to pay for something, you get access to a good. If not, you are excluded. The other characteristics is rivalness. Now, rivalness in the language of economists means that if I consume a part of that good or some fraction of that good or service, there's that much less that's available for other people. A simple example, if I go to the market and buy an apple, it means that that apple is mine. Now, even if I decide to share it, if I've taken a bite, there's that much less available for you to eat of that apple. It's a classic private good. Public goods, on the other hand, are non-excludable and non-rival. In other words, nobody can be kept out, and the consumption of that good by one person does not decrease its availability for others in any manner. Now, think of the nation's army, right? So the army is providing protection to all of us at the national borders, does not in any sense exclude anybody. All of us are protected. And there's also this property of non-rivalness in the sense that the army does not protect you any more than it protects me in the case of any security threat that the country faces, right? And this can apply to think of the air that we breathe, for instance, which is also sort of non-excludable. I can't exclude you, you can't exclude me, nor does my breathing the air leave any less for you once I breathe it, right? Now, this works well, except that over a period of time, we've also noticed that there are many other kinds of goods. So it's not a sharp distinction between the public and the private, but there's things that actually fall along a continuum. To give you just a couple of examples, you have, for instance, club goods, which are non-rival and excludable. Now, what are club goods? Think about literally a club, right, for which you pay a membership to belong to, right? So you pay membership, which means automatically those who can't pay are excluded. And then it's also non-rival. For all the members of the club, right, each one's enjoyment does not necessarily decrease how much the other members of the club are able to enjoy, let's say, the facilities and amenities or the company of one another in that club, right? Similarly, you also have what are called common pool resources, which are non-excludable but rival. Classic example is the village pasture, right, which everybody can access, but when all the cattle that belong to various people in the village start to graze, the more the grazing that happens, there's less that's available for those of other people, right? So in a sense, it's non-excludable and rival. Now, even if you had these intermediate categories, we could perhaps have lived with them. But what really complicates matters is that these boundaries are subject to constant change. Now, let's take the distinction between excludability and non-excludability. That difference, that distinction relies on property rights. So, for instance, earlier it used to be assumed that roads were non-excludable, I mean public roads, and that it was the state that would have to provide them. But now, with our changing assumptions or understanding or norms about what constitutes property rights, what can be private, what can be public, we increasingly are resorting to toll roads that are built and maintained by the private sector actors. So what used to be traditionally a state provided good is now increasingly provided, or at least parts of it are provided by the private sector. So that sort of alters the balance, right? Similarly, if you think about the distinction between rivalness and non-rivalness, technological change can upset that balance or shift that balance. So for here, let me give you an example. Think about, say, historical monuments or archaeological sites. where if you have too many visitors or beyond a point, there might be damage of some sort to the heritage site, right? On the other hand, if with contemporary technologies you're able to sort of build some kind of a representation, and you have virtual reality that allows walkthroughs and so on, where you're actually able to experience the site, the archaeological site, as though you were literally there, then it means that more people are likely to enjoy it, not without necessarily having to travel to that location. And second, it also means that not too many people actually, when not too many people have to go to that place, the likelihood of the deterioration of that monument is also likely to be at the least slowed, which means more people are likely to be able to enjoy it over a longer period of time. So the rivalness of that archaeological site also starts to decrease. So what we have here, because as we have changes in technology and as we have changing notions of what it means to what property rights mean or how they should be applied, this balance in terms of who should provide what and what constitutes a public good or a private good has really undergone a tremendous change, and in the bargain starts to pose challenges to us when we ask questions about how do we meet the needs of various segments of the population when we are faced with a variety of crises.
Okay, now if you look at our own country, I'll just sort of take a couple of quick examples. States consider it necessary to innovate and supply public goods where the returns are hard for the private sector, right? And in our country, there's, in my opinion, no better example than, say, ISRO, right? The private sector is not going to invest in a space program where the returns are not immediate, or you have no sort of clear time horizon, right? They want quarter-to-quarter results. That's not what happens with the space program, right? So you have this, the government investing in the space program, and sure, there are a lot of national benefits that probably come our way, but they're very hard to recoup, and especially for an individual private investor. Now that the government has established the program, you see opportunities slowly opening up. But it took more than 35 years to do that. And nobody's got that kind of money or patience in the private sector. On the other hand, markets are an ideal option to innovate and supply goods and services with pricing and an ability to exclude those who cannot pay is possible. And this is the model on which the Indian software industry and its exports have grown, right? Client approaches you, tells you this is what I need. These are the sort of the limits in terms of the contract, very contractually bound. And then say, I'll give you this, this is what you'll get paid, right? So these are sort of examples of extreme examples of what the state does and what the market can do for you. Now, unfortunately, a lot of things a lot of sort of goods and services fall between the cracks precisely because of the fuzziness of the analytical distinction between public goods and private goods. So, for instance, if at all firms address poorer markets, because see, they first of all they're not interested because the ability to pay is a problem. Right? Now, if at all they do, they typically resort to selling either obsolete products. I sold something for 10 years, I flagged it, let me see what else I can get. Or they indulge in something called defeaturing. I'll sell you somebody who can afford something with 10 features, somebody else gets it for 3 features, right? And then, if you look at it, both, states are not necessarily that different. Both states and markets typically rely on top-down models of innovation, and even if you indulge in things like pushing obsolete products or sort of defeaturing, they often tend to rely on very alien design assumptions. So if you design a product for a Scandinavian market or for a citizen in Scandinavia and expect to sort of push it down here, chances are it's not going to fly. And there's been plenty of examples. We can sort of talk about that later. There's another reason why this distinction between states and markets is not working, right? The sort of the analytical presumptions are coming apart. And this has to do with something called global public goods. Now, a good is globally public when its non-rival, non-excludable benefits impact more than one group of countries and does not discriminate against any population group or generation. Classic examples, climate change, right? It's a global challenge, right? Or for that matter, pandemics, right, that do not respect national boundaries. Now, why is it that there are analytical problems? Because these are public goods. These are not any single person's problem, right? They don't respect national boundaries. So what do you do about this? These are problematic institutionally because it's unclear who governs their production and delivery, since the provision and consumption of public goods are not conceptualized as being tradable across national boundaries. So when you think of the state as providing a public good, right, it's inevitably a national state. You don't have a global state. So that becomes a significant analytical problem. Now, the provision of public goods is simply not possible by rescaling of existing public goods because it challenges concepts of non-excludability. Am I going to provide the solution to that in India? And then how do I exclude somebody in Brazil or in some other corner of the earth, right? Problems of non-excludability are a serious challenge because it's the taxpayers here who are paying for it, right? Not somebody somewhere else. Now, as geographical distance and regulatory boundaries inevitably shape the accessibility to the sites of public goods provision, access is not uniformly distributed across the world. So you don't have a problem, or you don't have a concept of a global public good at all. Analytically, within this existing framework, which you've sort of inherited from the past, these new challenges that we are facing and are sort of literally in our face, we find it problematic to deal with. So what can we do? Right? So these are the two broad sort of reasons why analytically we need to think about these current challenges in a different manner. Now, this is also what they call wicked challenges. Things like pandemics, climate change, etc. Ill-formulated, information is confusing, and there is different values that are involved. These are not amenable to scientific solutions due to multiple interdependencies, and in a sense, you saw evidence of that in Madrid. All the negotiations around it. Now, it is in acknowledging the wickedness of these problems there has been a shift in expectations of development from mere economic growth to sort of being more broadly encompassing in the form of the MDGs and the SDGs. In a sense, these are all talking at a global level. How do we collectively deal with these challenges that we're now confronted with as a human race? Now, how do we sort of think about, there's a history to how we've been thinking about these things, and this goes to the point that Vidisha was talking about earlier. Now, in the 1980s, they said, let's sort of get across this, bridge the state market gap by what they call reinventing this governance, right? Very interesting phrase. And they typically took the form of public-private partnerships, where certain public sector obligations were met by the private sector, and for delivery of certain services. But the real problem with wicked problems is that shared goals and clear objectives are hard to put your finger on. That's what makes them wicked in the first place, right? Now, because of this difficulty in sort of bridging, okay, what we also know is that there has long existed for centuries non-governmental or non-profit organizations that fill developmental gaps. In various forms. You can be running schools, hospitals, etc. And I'm sure all of you know good examples of each of these. But what has happened, what was especially in the 19th and 20th century, is that states and markets viewed them as adversaries. Why? It's because NGOs hold states and firms to account, right? They sort of conduct audits of various sorts and tell the governments, you've not done this, this is your job, or tell companies, you guys are being dodgy, right? And they target the practices of firms, for instance. Now, therefore, not surprisingly, for firms, NGOs are sort of tree huggers or do-gooders with little or no understanding of the real world. But the thing is, one of the things that the third sector, the NGOs, do is that they approach design a little differently, right? Because they meet citizen needs locally with bottom-up design. But, in the sense, what they really rely on is what Michael Polanyi calls tacit knowledge, and what geographers have sort of gone on to say or sort of describe as spatially sticky knowledge, stuff that does not sort of easily enter textbook and can be sent off to different parts of the world. But this approach also had its own difficulties. For example, we had the appropriate technology movement, particularly in the 1970s. You have people like Schumacher and others who tried to come up with new approaches to design, but that had a whole set of problems with identifying technologies, geographical transferability, and so on. And also there was this perception of technological inferiority. And of course, in our own country, Jugaad thoroughly became the rage over the last decade or two, and for meeting sort of needs in conditions of scarcity. But this again, there's a lot of controversy which I don't want to get into. Is this just quick fix? Is this something that's actually going to give us a means, or is there an institutional mechanism for taking it across people with similar needs across the country, or much less the world, and so on, right? These are all debates that are still raging, and we still don't have an answer. There are some equivalents in China called Shanzai and Brazil's J2, which are also sort of similar ideas that have been floating around. Now, what's also happening at the same time over the last 30, 40 years is that we've been sort of really pushed to take these alternate approaches to design, right? Why? Because we've had, like I said, a growing realization that development is not only about economic growth, right? There are other challenges that we're confronting, especially environmental and social. There's been a greater social awareness that for all the prosperity, we have greater inequality, and such like. There's more crucially, especially in the advanced industrial world, there's demographic flattening, right? Populations are stable, if not rapidly declining. Japan is expected to go down by almost like 25–30%. Most of Southern Europe is sort of dwindling in numbers. So the traditional markets are all drying up. So they're saying, so people suddenly woke up and said, hey, you know what? Can we sort of look at these countries like South Asia or in Africa, etc., which have not had access to technology? Can we think about providing them with the goodies that we've been enjoying, if you might? And for that, of course, people very quickly realized that you needed alternate approaches to innovation. And there were, at least in the West, there's notions of what is called open innovation to mobilize assets from external partners, right? So companies started to work out, companies started to abandon very siloed approaches to innovation. They said, let's work with universities, a variety of other partners, and see how is it that we can benefit from the flows of ideas. These are the kinds of ideas that provided the empirical material or the that set a person like Paul Romer thinking, right? But effective open innovation requires an environment that's characterized by a strong presence of ideas, venture capital, startups, and high labor mobility, most of which you don't find in an environment like India or the so-called emerging world. Now, this is when attention started to turn to what came to be famously described as the bottom of the pyramid by the late Indian academic C.K. Prahalad, who said, can we actually address this group that earns less than $2 a day, that has had little or no prior access to goods and services, but can we make money out of that? That's a large number, right? They're just waiting to be addressed, and if you're able to address them in the right manner, that's a gold mine waiting to be cracked. Now, ethical issues aside, whether you want to actually make profit from somebody who has 2 square meals a day, there are other problems that they soon ran into, right? Now, first is the question of affordability. They were so far ignored simply because you can't provide them with private goods, right? There's sort of, especially, rival excludable public goods are simply out of their reach. Now, the other thing is the BOP, the bottom of the pyramid, is found in locations where infrastructure is typically weak to non-existent. Think about power, roads, what have you, very limited, right? So your ability to meet their needs is not simply a question of going there and saying, hey, let me figure that out. It's not that easy. I mean, the circumstances are hard. And finally, and this is what is sort of so galling about all of this, the bottom of the pyramid, estimated at 4 billion people at that time, who earned less than $2 a day, were simply treated as one homogeneous mass. Never mind that every state or parts of every state in India is so different. Not even begin comparing India with a diverse country like, say, Brazil or South Africa or others, right? So this whole notion of let's sort of get the BOP is both trivial, intellectually trivial, and socially arrogant. Right? So, but the thing is, yes, but there's also no getting away from the fact that many of these people do not have the, whether you call them necessities or luxuries, that all of us in this room enjoy. So what do we actually do to ensure that they get some access? Then there was this whole notion of frugal innovation. But the thing is, frugality is not just about cost cutting, right? It's a lot more complicated than that. And that's one of the things that the people who are sort of pushing this BOP line somehow didn't quite get. They must be easy to use, robust, and be sensitive to environmental impact. What in some cases they call, or in some sort of quarters they call, there must be a cradle to grave approach. It's not just let me make something, throw it at you, take the money and run, right? But the thing is, our understanding of innovation has also been historically rather limited. It's been mostly understood as a technology-driven process measured by factors such as technical labor force or outcomes. So you say, okay, this country is more innovative than that, or this company is more innovative than that. Why? They got more patents, more scientists, and so on. Right? But is that all to it? The incorporation of demand and user-side knowledge is unfortunately very under-theorized. In other words, when you say I want to innovate, it's not enough to say I have this army of fine engineers and I've got this sort of huge sort of bag of patents. If that alone were enough, the Microsofts, the Googles of the world would have solved everybody's problems. With no disrespect to them, but that's what they've got all these supply side inputs. What they're clearly lacking, and why many of them are even bothering to come to a place like India, is the fact that can you think about alternate constraints? Those are the institutions. What are the alternate constraints, whether they are formal or informal, that we need to design for, of the kind that we've not yet encountered in our home countries? That's where the institutional logic kicks in. Right? But one of the problems with innovation, and especially in the frugal innovation, is that you don't have lead users. Who are lead users? People who can test your products and services on. When somebody has never seen a fancy smartphone, how can he or she be a lead user when, how can you actually test your products? I mean, you can't say, is this better than that? When there's no baseline, right? When your thoughts are not even in that direction, right? So you're running in, and typically if you look at how firms develop market products, they typically rely on lead users because they provide them with benchmarks. You don't have any benchmarks here. Now, that's when, people again started, if you look at the intellectual journey of this, that they moved from frugal innovation to this whole notion of social innovation, which is actually very, very hard to define. Let's not sort of kid ourselves about that. One sort of reasonably decent definition is the creation of new products, services, organizational structures, or activities that are somehow better or more effective than traditional public sector, philanthropic, or market-aligned approaches in responding to social exclusion. In other words, it's something that's better than what the governments or the states can offer you, better than what the private sector of firms can offer you. It's better than what the NGOs on their own can offer you, right? So it's something that's superior in some sense of the term. In some sense of what each of these can offer you in terms of innovation. Now, what we've increasingly been seeing is that social innovation relies on new technologies such as ICTs to create new business models and micro modes of delivery to resolve socio-spatial accessibility. In other words, to get to remote locations, to get to demographics, to get to social groups that have historically been ignored, and to challenge last mile problems. Can you get your medicines to the primary healthcare center, for instance, in a remote tribal area, right, which is very hard to access? And so those kinds of issues are, yes, sir.
Pardon, it is not very relevant, but I hear of two institutions, government and market. I was just thinking about public movement. You briefly talked about NGOs, but do public movements also come into the equation somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, see, the thing is, the idea here is to acknowledge that they've played an increasingly important role because they've provided, if you call it the band-aid, because where states have failed, where markets have failed to address different needs. So they've provided the band-aid to help meet certain various citizen needs. And they've done a pretty good job of it in some cases. So this does not ignore what they've been saying. So it just says that states and markets have been dominant, NGOs have been filling in the crevices, but none of that adds up to the kind of inclusion that we'd like to see. That's the point. Now here, you see, technology is useful. However, though we've talked about use of ICTs and so on, technology is useful, but it's far from being sufficient. Okay? Now, so in the pursuit of social innovation, and this is what things get interesting. What we've been increasingly witnessing in the last 15 to 20 years is that firms have been turning to NGOs, okay, because their grassroots links provide the design of goods and services around community participation, right? Because firms in a sense are saying we have the technical skills, right, but we haven't the faintest idea of how to define the problem. That's where you guys will come in, right? Now, NGOs therefore provide your crucial sort of last mile connectivity to lead users in local markets, and they offer spatially sticky tacit knowledge that firms find hard to define on their own, right? Because if you're a bunch of white coats sitting in a lab in Bangalore or any other metropolitan city, you might as well be sitting in Redmond, right? Makes no difference. Now, in the Indian case, I think we've also been helped by the passage of the Companies Act of 2013, which actually mandates corporate social responsibility, where up to 2% of your profits, above a certain level, once you hit a certain level of profitability, has to be set aside for designated areas of corporate social responsibility. And given that most firms don't seem to have much of an idea how to do it, they're bringing in the NGOs to work with them, right? So this kind of, and India is sort of unique because we're the first country in the world where the Companies Act has been amended and CSR spending has been mandated. Now, what's also happening, interestingly, is that working together, so you have firms and you have NGOs working together because, see, this is a mutual advantage, right? For firms, they get this sticky knowledge. For NGOs, they get access to resources and they get technological capabilities which they themselves don't have. Now, you have the big NGOs like the Gates Foundation and World, WWF and all that. But the vast majority are mom and pop operations, right? Good heart, beyond that, little else. So you need those capabilities, right? And then they also started to work together with states, with governments. Why? Because governments bring in something which neither markets nor NGOs can bring in. Governments bring in scale. If you want access to 5,000 primary schools or healthcare centers, nobody else can deliver that. So you see this sort of growing sense of partnership. Now, working together, especially between firms and NGOs, is resulting in what I call institutional isomorphism. It's a sociological term, where NGOs are increasingly adopting the processes and structures of firms to demonstrate accountability to users. Saying, look, we're not here to just take your money and squander it. And quite often you see these NGOs, these ex-corporate types who are there saying, we can talk your language, whatever the auditors will require, we'll be able to provide you. Now, with firms bringing in technology and skills, NGOs bring knowledge of local communities. The state is a crucial partner as it allows services in areas such as health or education to scale. In other words, the state is allowing, right, the encroachment into the boundaries of what is called traditional public goods of markets and NGOs. So you see the shifts that are taking place. If you go back to that diagram that I put up a few slides ago, right? So that's what's happening in the provision of this, because that, in a sense, is a reflection of the inadequacy of that framework. Now, the blurring of distinction between the public and the private domains, where the public interest may be represented by non-governmental entities or even by market actors, right? So that's really what's happening. We'll be able to provide certain goods and services, where traditionally it was the state that was doing it, right? So you see the blurring of these distinctions. Now, where the blurring happens is what we refer to as the hybrid domain, which provides an institutional framework to produce social innovation by combining social and economic missions. Because let's face it, as Milton Friedman, one of the early Nobel laureates in economics, said, the business of business is business. Right? So what they want is profitability. But the economic mission oftentimes cannot ensure the ability to accomplish social missions, because the state is able to invest and think long term, think the space program, right? So it is that ability to combine the social and the economic that's where the sort of the hybrid domain offers you institutional space. Now this is what it looks like. So this is a photograph from a school outside Bangalore, where early on you used to have donors, list of donors. Write a check, go away, feel good. Most of them are companies, or almost all of them, ITC, 3M, cable and wireless, etc. These are conventional relationships. But if you look at this one, you see a change that has been happening, and this is something we empirically documented. You see Intel Foundation, Intel Bangalore, right? You see Cisco Foundation, Cisco Networks, Microsoft Research, MIT Media Labs, Boston Museum of Science, Department of Education, Government of Karnataka, University of Agricultural Sciences, Tamil Nadu Government, National University of Singapore, Asha Foundation, Jaipur Village. So you see the corporate world, the government, the NGOs all coming together to transform education. This is a school outside Bangalore. It's actually on the way to the airport. Now the hybrid domain is distinguished by bottom-up characteristics, where stakeholders, initially uncoordinated and disparate, gradually articulate a pragmatic solution-oriented agenda in hybrid missions to generate design for wicked problems. Really what it's about is saying, let's come together. We have a problem for which you don't have a well-defined solution. We don't even know what the problem is, clearly. So let's come together and see what we can do. It's not necessarily about saying, who gets the IP, etc. I mean, this is the question I get often asked. Oh, they develop all these things, who gets the IP? When there's no P, where's the IP? Right? There's no property. You don't even know what the answer is. You don't know what the question is. Right? So what we're talking about here is, can we think about ways and means of coming together to develop some solution which may become property in the event of your being blessed by institutions. Now, governing this pragmatism necessitates hybrid governance, which involves interactions between two axes of transformation. One is newly emerging hybrid norms that combine economic and social missions, require what's called domain flexibility between the private domain and the public domain. That is the division of labor between the public, private, civil society, and hybrid organizations. You see these sort of flexibility across these domains, right? Second, in order to deal with the other inadequacy, the global public goods, you need to increasingly have geographical rescaling. From subnational to the global, as the scale of governance demands what's called scalar flexibility. State-centered approaches to governance are rendered increasingly obsolete, especially when you're faced with the challenges of providing global public goods. It's not that the state is rendered obsolete. Please be very clear. Not all solutions necessarily have a state-centered approach or will be amenable. So this is what we're talking about. So there's a governance gap. There's what's called a double failure, market and state. This, for those of you who are familiar with Karl Polanyi, that's where that comes from, okay? And there are these new organizational arrangements that we posit with domain flexibility, where there are cross-domain collaborations and hybrid organizations, combined with scalar flexibility, where there's what we call transnational social entrepreneurship, and I'll come to that in a moment, to design new solutions for social impacts and application by potentially applying new technology, although technology is not a necessary or a sufficient condition. Let me be very clear about that. This is primarily, the argument here is primarily institutional. Yes?
We are introducing a service in the form of NGO between government/market and the actual consumer or user. Because the intermediary has been introduced, there will be some shift in the welfare, which will go into NGO's function. It can be either from the government or market or from the consumer. I would assume that in a government-mediated not worry about profit. It might give some of its welfare to the NGO for its function. But in the case of a market intermediate market or a private fund will not give that welfare and it will be robbed from consumers. Is that a good model?
It's not a, see, that's a normative question. But that's why you have the that's why you have the Companies Act being modified, saying, I don't care what you say, you're going to have to part with 2%. That's where the welfare is being transferred. And then because these companies are not necessarily aware of how they should go about this, they're seeking these people. And, you know, I would be very careful in using the term intermediary to label the NGOs, because I see them, the conceptualization has become, they become equal partners because they actively contribute to the hybrid domain.
So the reason why I'm saying that intermediary is that there is a tax, I mean, there is a taxation on the production, I mean, which can go into the, the wages of the NGO. Or the proper
of course, because, but the thing is, when the part of this whole thing is, if you are not interested in expanding the scale of inclusion, then you can think of it as a tax. But this is something that you willy-nilly, if you say we've decided we're going to do this by any means, we just don't know how. So we will do what we can. Right? That's the point. Amit, can you question? Because I have two examples I want to give, and then we can close and have a Q&A. Right? So I'm going to provide you with two examples. One is what is called a cross-domain effort. That's the domain flexibility to fight TB. Now, of course, it's well known that we have the largest prevalence of TB, unfortunately, in this country, and there's something called the WHO DOTS, treatment course that is very well defined. It's nothing, but the prevalence has nothing to do with the treatment. It is primarily a social issue, right? The disease affects the poor, and daily wage labor often cannot take the medications regularly. So what happens if you don't? You make a bad situation worse, and then there is social stigma because TB can be infectious, right? So you don't want to even let other people know that you have this disease. Now, there was an NGO established in 2006, which gave itself the noble goal of saying, we're going to eradicate TB in this country, and initially in the slums of Delhi. And they said, we will take the medicines given free, the government gives it for free, the central government, we'll take it to the areas where people need them. They hired community workers locally to inconspicuously give medicines from routinely frequented spots like grocery stores or temples. Anywhere people will go to them. So let's make these people a part of that landscape, social landscape. Workers also visited families to counsel them on the spread of, or limiting the spread of infection, providing them with some education. Now, the multinational, the NGO also partnered with a multinational R&D center, which designed a low-cost sort of biometric system with fingerprint to register new patients and record every dose taken. Right? So every time you take the dose, you have that, and then it becomes available, and they're able to say, okay, you took your dose. If you don't, then the worker is able to go and remind them and say, you forgot your dosage for the day. Right? And so that's how they kept track. Now the tablet is connected to a server which highlights missed dosages to community workers and program managers, and it allowed them sort of dropout rates from about 32% to 3%. Now the NGO now sort of has gone across the country, many states, many other sort of parts of the world, has been widely recognized, many awards, etc. Now this is an instance of domain flexibility of a fundamentally social problem with state providing a quasi-public good. In the sense, the state provides the medicines, sources it, provides the medicines. That mostly comes for free, right? Then you have the private sector technology, and then you have last mile delivery by an NGO. This is an instance of what I'd call domain flexibility. Now, there's another example. I'm taking this again from the health sectors, where you have scalar flexibility for vaccine supplies. Scalar flexibility, like I said, has to do with geographical rescaling in order to deal with certain social challenges. Now, again, weak infrastructure, rural supply chains hurt the poor the hardest, especially when you need access to things like vaccines, which are time sensitive, which are not going to be effective once you cross a certain timeline. It has to be sort of refrigerated and so on. To attack this problem, an American of Indian origin with elite private school university, MIT, Johns Hopkins, right, returned to India after working for more than a decade in building supply chains for the US Army, right? So that was his prior experience. Did that for them. And the US Army requirements of network architectures and redundancies were very akin, he found, to rural requirements. And he set up, and this is the kind of person I would call a transnational social entrepreneur. Somebody who's sort of gone across these boundaries, and he basically used an open source cloud-based logistics MIS to build sort of network agnostic feature phones to collect and receive last mile data, right? So having done that, what he did was he said, he started to partner with state government primary healthcare centers where vaccines were not available on time. And that is the big challenge, right? And so what he could do with this, with whatever he put together with this MIS is to, create a bunch of dashboards and data analytics for inventory and order management and for storing and for monitoring storage conditions because vaccines are temperature sensitive. In 2008, with a grant from the Deshpande Foundation, he tested an idea at the MIT's Innovations in International Health Lab, followed by a survey of 150 villages in Karnataka. The first deployment was with an NGO managing primary healthcare centers in a remote tribal region. This is Chamarajnagar, right? It doesn't get worse than that in Karnataka. And one of the things that he was able to do was, he was able to sort of increase vaccine availability, stock replacement times, etc. Now, what he has done there, right, now manages to support 400 or 500 million vaccines annually in India and, in a variety of other countries in Africa. Now, there's another question that typically tends to ask that I'm going to sort of answer and sort of preempt immediately, which is to say, look, are these necessarily, this guy, whereas the first instance, when I talked about an NGO-led model, that remains an NGO. This guy, interestingly, has both a for-profit and a non-for-profit organization, right? So what he does is that through the for-profit organization, he manages to support a lot of his technology development and so on, which is then given to the not-for-profit organization, which retains the license, etc., so that they're then able to use it for reaching out to the poorest sections of society. I mean, so that their actual outreach, right, is done through the non-profit arm. But where they actually get compensated internationally through the WHO, etc., they work for it through the for-profit arm. So many of these people are also increasingly adopting dual institutional models where you keep a for-profit arm and a not-for-profit arm, where you work with a variety of other institutions, including the state, in this case, the primary healthcare centers in Chamarajnagar, right, to ensure that you're able to deliver healthcare or whatever good and service that people are being otherwise deprived of. Okay. The hybrid domain sort of helps overcome problems of inclusive development, especially for the BOP population. In other words, it provides a certain kind of institutional space. It doesn't guarantee any results, but then it helps us overcome the analytical limits of our thinking that have thus far informed our approaches to these kinds of problems. Now, approaching or achieving frugal innovation is hard because of the circumstances and the diversity of the BOP population. And really, the argument here is that increasingly obsolete institutional means of pitting states versus markets. Right? These are all sort of seen as adversaries. And the increasingly fuzzy public-private distinctions, and because NGOs are also now able to offer alternatives. Now, therefore, you have an impasse overcome with sort of emerging institutional approaches that lead to a blending of organizational logics and missions, that is domain flexibility, and combining resources, capital, skills, technologies with local knowledge. For example, in the second example, the guy was trained at fancy institutions, very well-known institutions abroad, got capital from abroad, got some of the technology, then went and sort of said, how is it that I can actually think about applying this to certain kinds of domains where there are significant gaps in problem definition to begin with, and then let's figure out a solution. Now, domain flexibility and scalar flexibility actually reinforce one another. In the TB case, domain flexibility led to scalar flexibility. So they were able to do certain things in a place in the poorer sections of Delhi, and then they were able to take it to other parts of Asia. Whereas in the supply chain case, it was the other way around. You had these technologies, you have these various kinds of expertise coming here, combining with other domains like the state and so on in order to generate certain kinds of solutions. So over a period of time, this is only for a period of sort of, this is only more for this distinction between the scalar and the domain flexibility is primarily to sort of explain the concept better rather than necessarily being sort of very orthogonal in nature. All right, I'm done. Amit had a question first. I'll take Amit.
One is the CSR element, which says that we are introducing some sort of a NGO and therefore whatever was the surplus in the entire chain, now it shifts, some of that will shift from either the state market to the NGO or the consumer user to the NGO. So that's one kind of argument. The other is, which is not CSR logic, which is entering into new and previously untapped market segment-based logic. And that's where emerging markets are. So these are markets which were previously hidden, they were invisible, they were not non-existent. So these organizations are opening up these market spaces for the other side, for the state or the firm, and therefore it's not a tax, and therefore it's not the surplus that's getting appropriated. The surplus or the value that's coming out is an entirely new value that's created. It's not a reappropriation, but it's something that's new, and therefore in that creation of that novelty, the new segment you need, or that segment would not have been created unless someone like this hybeid, all these three coming together happened. So that is what I wanted to do.
Yeah, I think I'm in more or less in agreement with you in the sense that it's not, see, we don't even know whether this is going to be commercially viable or not. But you don't even have a solution to begin with, and that's really what you're worried. I mean, the appropriability is not what I'm really interested in here. The question is, can you even design something that can meet the needs of segments that have been excluded so far? Shiva.
My question was the two examples that I'm noting. Hello?
It's working.
The question is that in the two examples you mentioned, there was a scalability aspect. So how does that come into play in the model? Then it started as a one-piece thing and it scaled to millions of people. So what are the changes that were made to make it possible to go to that scale?
Okay, it's not simply a question of scaling where you traditionally scale up and you sort of lower cost. That's really not what we're talking about here. It's about saying in order to do that, see, yes, I do know that part of the challenge is to reach out to millions of people, but because there are many, many of them who do not have access to either a vaccine or whatever it is that we're looking for. The question is, what are the institutional arrangements that we need to put in place to ensure that, right? It's not a question of just putting in place a process, a particular kind of,
It's not one fix everything.
No, that's true. So the thing is, this is not, to see what we're talking about, the hybrid domain is a combining of the social and economic missions. How that happens in healthcare, how that happens in other domains may vary. That's why I chose to stick to the healthcare domain here. Otherwise, you can beat me with a pretty large fat stick, right? The thing is, the scalability, right, or how much you scale, okay, is not necessarily numerically sort of computable here, as much as it's saying, look, can I get that right institutional mix, right? And that is the key to the scalability. Who are the stakeholders, who are the actors here? Who is it that actually needs to be tapped? What is it that they can offer, right? In ways in which, and what does it mean in terms, you may have to transform certain institutional constraints. The transformation or the passage of the Companies Act, for instance, in India, opened a certain kind of institutional space, right? Can you do that in other locations? Can you, for instance, reduce the property rights that you bestow on pharmaceutical companies in order to ensure that certain kinds of say HIV drugs or other drugs are actually available, right? Because if the goal is cure, then you must be thinking about these things. So that's all critical to scalability. It's not just do I reduce cost of production. I'll come.
The question is accountability. We are talking of states that are clear accountability mechanism, and talking of market, it works on market logic, right? But here something like, for example, Akshay Patra, they would assume is broadly fit into the example of hybrid innovation. So how does accountability work? Like with the private actor, with the NGOs, what it fits into the method?
Yes, it is. It is. So the thing is, there are two parts to that. Two parts to my answer to your question. The somewhat lamer answer, right, is the fact that part of the notion of this hybrid domain is really to create the space to create the Akshay Patra. In the sense to say, look, I know that we need to have this kind of, mass feeding, etc. How do we actually go about it? Who are the people who should actually be taking the lead? Who should be doing what? The definition of those roles, playing with them, etc., or sort of tweaking with them, and in order to come up with something that you now call Akshay Patra, is part of what the hybrid domain actually offers. You see the point? Rather than saying that that is going to be continuously, because once you set up that space, then you institutionalize certain roles, saying this is precisely your role, that's precisely your role, and then you also sort of convert that into possibly some kind of a contractual agreement saying you got to do this, otherwise you're going to be held responsible. Before that even happens, can I actually figure out who is going to do this? How can we do this? We know if feeding children or overcoming measles is a problem. Rather than we know the state has failed, the market has failed, we know NGOs alone cannot do it on their own. How do we come together? What is the configuration, the conjunctural configuration of institutions? You had a position.
I somewhat related to what Rajiv asked, that you said social innovation is a space which combines social and economic missions.
Yes.
Hybrid domain.
Hybrid domain.
Where is the politics?
Huh? So the thing is this. So in terms of asking where the politics is, the fact that you have priorities that are being set in each of these domains, right? So why is it that somebody should actually pursue certain kinds of healthcare solutions? Why is it that within the hybrid domain you want to pursue malaria, or do you want to pursue TB cure? These are all inherently political in themselves. Okay, so it is not that there is no politics. They're clear, because the state can say, we will not open that space up for you. End of story. And really that is a lot of these struggles about how you can access, or people saying, look, we would like to do this here or there. And in fact, I can give you examples, for example, in a case study that we did where a large NGO works in Bihar and Jharkhand, etc., looking at diarrhea and problems that afflict children. With funding from the Gates Foundation, where the Bihar government has actually given them access to a lot of PHCs, etc. The problem is now there's a lot of backlash against the NGOs saying that why is it that why is the funder taking or dictating? Is the funder dictating all the priorities, right? So the thing is, there is a politics about how priorities get set. What is it that we actually choose to attack?
And also sometimes, because when you're talking about a health issue, I think the problematization sometimes becomes that there are a lot of these diseases. But if you think about some other, that whole wicked problem thing, when the problematization itself is very problematic, then how do you politically, balance?
So the thing is, that's part of the negotiation that takes place between these actors. Say, look, how do we actually say that this is even a problem worth considering?
Yeah.
Right?
And
so,
how much NGOs have a say?
See, that is can be empirically determined. There is no a priori way of saying that this is going to necessarily be dictated by the NGOs or the states. See, in some cases, for example, you have the states actually literally abdicating their responsibility. Saying, you guys have come, you got the resources, you just help us do it, and this used to be our responsibility, we messed up, right? And then in other cases, you have the states doing that, I mean, markets doing that, you have NGOs also doing that. So it's not that it is devoid. I mean, see, where this sort of politics actually should be studied is one level lower. In terms of looking at it in terms, like you rightly said, health we know, like we could, maybe this is how we define a problem. And the question is, what is the domain you're actually talking about? Rather than simply saying, and in partly sort of acknowledging this kind of a question is, again, like I said, I chose to, my case studies come from the same domain. Because if it had been from healthcare and education, for instance, just as an example, you could jolly well say, why is it that it's, these can well be treated very differently, right? So it's not that it is not, but then it really depends on the level of granularity you go to. This is not the end of the, this talking of the hybrid mission or the hybrid domain and the sort of the hybrid missions is not the end of the story. It's not the final answer, right? It just provides a particular lens, which where the primary goal is to spotlight to throw the spotlight on the intellectual inadequacies about our current thinking of these problems. And this is a possible alternative which needs greater granularity if you need to work out the details, whether it is the politics or whether it's to figure out who's walking away with it, the surplus. Right? So this is work in progress. Yes, Janaki. Who else had her hand?
The role of the NGO in the two cases was in either redefining the problem or in suggesting the solution. The role that it saw was in development and benefit outcomes.
Yeah. Please.
Just conceptually, I'm trying to grapple with the idea of a ticket problem. What makes the problem ticket? Is there something implicit about the problem that makes it ticket? Or is it in a particular empirical situation it looks like a ticket problem? For instance, if you look at the Indian PDS system, it works very differently and harmlessly in some cases and not so much in others. A variety of reasons, right? So is the PDS as a system a ticket problem? It could look like that if you look at, I don't know which should tell you this thing. But if you look at, say, Chhattisgarh 5 years back or Tamil Nadu, it works very well, right? So is that the ticket problem, or how do I know a ticket problem?
Okay, so the thing is, if you're not sure, I mean, if you're not even sure what is it that you're actually trying to define, right? And this difference between Chandigarh and Tamil Nadu, for instance, is a useful one or a useful starting point, because what you're looking at is a very different state. So I don't think the level of looking at it as just PDS necessarily alone will be useful. So then you're actually talking about different states which are possibly intervening in these programs in different ways. I'm not a PDS expert, but all I can say is that if you look at things where the state has a significant stay, so you do have to think about what is the state politics, why is it actually not being delivered, and then the question is, from whose vantage is it not being delivered? Why is it actually not being, somebody can come and say, we're doing very well. Somebody may say we're not doing very well, right? So where is the definition actually falling? Where is the problem? And many of these issues, you do have these kinds of issues that are where things fall through the cracks, right? So that would be my response to this